dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. Welcome to episode 36. I'm Claire, I'm here with Marsha for our discussion of Dune, which could be a very long episode, but we'll do our best. So, Marsha, the quick summary. Go for
Yes,
it.
given the hard task. Okay, yes. So Dune is about a galaxy which is ruled by this emperor figure, and in this galaxy, all the planets are run off this resource called spice, which can only be acquired on the planet Dune, or Arrakis, as they refer to. So Dune is sort of colonized. There's different houses, by the way. Each house kind of has their own planet. Um, Dune itself doesn't have a house. Instead, it's sort of ruled by the Harkonnen house, the House of Harkonnen. But they're kind of like horrible people who abuse the native people of Arrakis, called the Fremen. And so the Emperor decides that the Harkonnens will no longer control Arrakis, and they put in the House of Atreides. This is sort of still in the first film, and this is sort of part of a plot to cause the downfall of the House of Atreides. And so the House of Harkonnen and the sort of army of the Emperor, or the army from the home planet of the Emperor, team up to ambush House of Atreides on Dune, and basically sort of kill everyone off. But before this happens, there's this sort of group, sort of sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit, who send out different sort of missionaries to the different houses, acting as sort of advisors. And they're sort of like pulling all the strings in the background. Um, and they kind of have their own sort of like magical powers, and they have this power called the voice, and they manipulate everyone. And the sort of Bene Gesserit leader says to the leader of the Harkonnens to spare our main character Paul and his mother Jessica. So Paul is the heir to the House of Atreides, and him and his mother manage to escape because Paul is part of this big sort of, I guess, hoax. He's part of this made-up prophecy about being the Messiah that's gonna free the Fremen people of Dune, and lead them to a paradise and create a
Mm.
paradise on their planet. But as we sort of find out, this prophecy has been made up by the Bene Gesserit as, I guess, sort of to use Paul as a tool in sort of political goals, and
Yeah.
but this quickly spirals out of control, and Paul, in fact, does sort of become the Messiah of the Fremen, and he leads a resistance against the Harkonnens, sort of like tearing up their spice harvesting, and this basically leads to, well, we end the second film at the beginning of a holy war as they sort of create a Fremen army against the Empire, and
Mm.
that's where we're left off in the movies. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there you go. Hopefully that was like
That's not bad.
a
That's not
good
bad.
summary.
As Masha
um,
implied, we're talking about the films here. Do you know when the third one is out? Next year,
so the
maybe? Not
yeah, I
I'm
don't. I'm not sure
because
because the
this
other one
part
came out
two came
last year.
out last year, yeah,
Yeah,
and I think the one before
2024.
that was 2021, I think, because I think it was a
Yeah.
pandemic film. So we get three films from this bit, but for those who have read the book or are interested in doing so, it's based on a novel by Frank Herbert. The
Hmm.
first novel, Dune, came out in 1965. It won all the major awards, the Hugo, the Nebula, and then he kept going. So there are six further books, which we may allude to in passing, but not too much today. Sorry, there are 6 books in total by Frank, and then more by his son, and then there's been films and TV shows and so on. So there's loads that we could talk about. So please don't write in complaining that we're going to focus on the film. We know it's a great book, and we will refer to it in passing.
Yeah,
But
yeah, we will.
yeah, but
But yeah,
we try to keep to about an hour. So
exactly. We don't, yeah, otherwise we'd be here all day. But yeah, we'll
exactly.
make references. So there'll be like slight spoilers
Mm.
of,
Oh
but I
yes, we
don't
are not a spoiler-free podcast. So,
not a
you
spoiler
have to
free
go, you have to
podcast,
go away and do
unfortunately.
your work first. You have to read the books,
Exactly.
uh, listen to the
I
audiobooks
mean,
or whatever.
I
Yeah.
definitely don't think it'll spoil your overall enjoyment of the
Mm.
third. You'd probably understand the third film even more as a
Yeah.
result of listening
Yeah.
to the pod. So you're here
And
for the right
I think it's
reasons.
worth saying that the films are very good in their own right, as well as
Yes.
being
Yeah.
quite true to the book, as well as a film can be. I do with some modernizations and things, but by and large, I think that they are spectacular films.
Yeah.
I didn't see either of them in the cinema, and I regret that
I
really because I
know, me
think they
too.
would be, they're definitely big
It's
screen
the kind of
films.
film, yeah, you want
Mm,
like especially the sound. I don't know, like the
mm,
whole every aspect of the movies brings the like exceptional world building to
yeah.
life.
Mm,
So it's very immersive. So we definitely suggest if you
yeah.
can. I don't know where
Yeah.
would be showing it, but there'll be cinemas out there that will be
There
showing the
will, and
films.
presumably somewhere will do a full run of them when the third one comes out.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that world building then. I mean that's obviously one of the things that makes this a bit different from some of the fiction that we talk about, insofar as it's not a dystopia in the sense of a familiar near future or a variant on our kind of world as it stands. This is removed to another another world, another solar system,
Hmm.
in a future that is quite distinct from many of the sort of science fiction futures we look at. Um,
Yeah.
and Dune is obviously a very distinctive planet in the way that it's created. So, what did you think about the world that Frank Herbert and then the films create?
Well, I guess what's quite distinctive about it from other sort of far futures that we've
Mm.
looked at before is like, where are the robots,
Yeah, I
Which
think Dune is famous for it not being a future of computers.
of
Relatively
computers, yeah,
unusual for the 1960s because obviously the
definitely.
early computing, and so people were envisioning where this was going to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite clever that like Herbert was like, I'm not gonna bother with any of this like technology
Mm,
prediction nonsense.
mm.
He was
No,
like, I'm not gonna try and
he's
like imagine what it would look like.
yeah. There's something in the first book where it's like they've moved on from computers. So it's like that was the sort of
Yeah,
like past technology, and now they're like harnessing the full potential of the human mind, which is obviously a big theme in the text. In the film, we get a few kind of like mind governed sort of missile hubs and things like that. But by and large, as you say, it's not a techie film.
yes.
And in fact, people are mostly, stabbing
They
each other
would
with swords and stuff.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just so it's just in from my reading that all the robots were destroyed in the Butlerian Jihad, which
There
is
you
just I guess
go.
another war. So
Yeah. One of the
apparently they didn't
things
go
you can
into very much
find out
detail.
is, yeah, Herbert, I mean, just at the back of my copy here of Dune, has got some appendices. It's got a long appendix on the religion, the Bene Gesserit motives, the ecology. So he is like world
Yeah.
building of a like Tolkien style. It's
Yes.
there's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
history
yeah.
and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think
Um,
it's like what it keeps it quite like contemporary because I feel like
mm,
especially a lot of the science fiction of that day
yeah.
um didn't really predict very many things of the modern time or what it really looks like.
Mm,
So yeah, I think it keeps it kind of current. Like it
yeah.
doesn't seem dated, I guess.
Mm. And I suppose the way in which it sort of
Yeah.
fits into that kind of dystopian idea is it's remote. Yeah, okay, this is a world where people travel on spaceships and they require this mysterious spice to make space travel possible and so on, or fast space travel possible or whatever. But the human nature side of things, it draws on a long history. I think Herbert thought about becoming a historian. I think that was one of his interests. But yeah, so instead, what we get is a kind of drawing on where you were talking about kind of like the idea of imperialism and the imperial houses, a feudal system where they're all barons and dukes and counts and things like that.
Yeah.
So a kind of aristocratic system of rule, a colonial idea with the subjugation of the Fremen. And even within those ideas about kind of like the great houses and things like that, the better and worse versions of that, and all the machinations that you get in, your sort of historical novel or your Game of Thrones or something like that, but played out on planetary sort of scale.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, we don't really see a lot of space travel happening within the movies at all. It is very much just
No,
read
they sort of
on
hop in and hop out, don't they? And at
Arrakis.
the
Yeah,
very end, they're setting off into kind of like taking it bigger, as you say, like a
yeah,
universe-wide war. But yeah,
yeah. So
yeah,
I'm
mostly we're
excited to
obviously
see.
on
Yeah,
on
on
Dune, as you say.
on June.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what was fantastic in the films to see was the like Harkonnen planet, where
Mm.
seemingly their sun. I don't know. I've not done much research
Mm.
on this. This is
No.
just what I've seen visually. But their sun only,
Mm.
I guess you can only get black and white like light.
Yeah.
So all of
Yeah.
the everything outside is just black and white. But obviously when
Mm.
they like sort of step inside into a different
Mm.
lighting, then everything becomes in color. Um,
Yeah.
but that was like a very interesting. I don't know if that's like mentioned in the books or whether that's a specific
Not that
film
I
choice.
remember, but it works obviously beautifully as a film choice because it allows us
Yeah.
to firstly distinguish, I guess, the sort of idea of the Harkonnens, but also it contributes to the way in which Denis Villeneuve has used the kind of aesthetic of the Third Reich, Nazi Germany,
Yes.
brutalist architecture,
Mm.
also drawing on kind of like there's a gladiatorial games and so on, so drawing on that idea of kind of the Roman imperialism. So the aesthetic becomes something that is reminiscent of history, whilst also in this sort of science fiction world, making it obviously very clear to us Harkonnen's bad. The Harkonnen's bad thing I think is quite interesting insofar as a little bit of a tangent, but they had to make some decisions, I think, about which bits about kind of like what makes it clear to us that Baron Harkonnen is really bad. So he's enormously fat. And so this is a bit of a sort of fat
Classic.
phobic
Yep.
problem that we have with him. It's reflexive, I think, of extreme greed, which of course then colours his ideas, like ideas around his treatment of the spice and that sort of thing. So in that sense, it's kind of supposed to be decadence rather than fatness in and of itself,
Mm.
I think. But in the books, he also has a particular sexual penchant for adolescent men, um,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if they're enslaved and drugged.
Yes. Well, we see a little bit of that with the drugged contestants in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
like sort of amphitheater,
yeah.
um
So most of that kind of
gladiator.
like, yeah, the sort of enslavement and the drugging and things like that we do see played out in the way that people are treated. Fortunately, that
Yeah.
kind of like decadence equals gay equals bad kind of thing has been removed, although there is
Removed.
still a sort
Yeah.
of homoerotic moment between him and his nephew,
Yeah.
who is even
Goes
more
in for a
psycho
second
than
kiss.
anything.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, that
Um,
was interesting.
that's the kind of like these are the people who've obviously been governing this planet. The thing that, of course, is really striking about the planet itself is that it is a desert world, and the thing that makes Frank Herbert's world distinctive from so many of the sort of, I mean, well, we were talking about Snowpiercer and kind of like living in the ice, but this is much more about adapting to live in a planet that is completely dry, where water is
Yeah, arid, yeah.
a very scarce
Scarce.
commodity. While we're thinking about that kind of world building and that idea about the sort of the dry planet and so on, some people have read this as like the beginning of kind of cli-fi climate fiction. It has a strong ecological
Mm.
message. Herbert was very interested in that. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, particularly like the way in which the Fremen kind of like interact with their planet
Yeah.
versus
Well,
how the Harkonnens treat it.
yeah, I guess the Fremen survival is based on the ability to sort of live in harmony with the
Mm.
desert, which like kind of comes into like our modern vision of sustainability,
Mm.
and also like how the desert and its climate sort of shapes Fremen culture. But yeah, I mean, obviously the ecosystem produces spice, and
Mm.
that's what like the whole galaxy, I get like the whole galaxy's economics and also politics is sort of like centered around as this like one planet, which in the later story we hear about how in the second film, Paul's role and in the prophecies, so he says that how he's going to turn Dune into paradise, and that he sees in the future that this arid place, this desert planet is going to become this like green paradise. And we see other people had tried to previously accomplish that too. I think in the first film there was that lab, sort of like secret laboratory about trying to experiment, and that initiative was stopped by the houses and by the empire to continue spice production.
Yeah. Essentially, if you don't have a desert, then you don't get spice. So the potential for making it green is there, but but not if you are prioritizing what you can take and strip from the planet.
So when Paul's son Leto II does turn the desert into this sort of green paradise, it does, it disrupts the ecological conditions for spice formation, and therefore like destabilizes the whole galaxy, which I think is like Herbert's way of examining the risks of like tying your political economic system to this like single ecological resource, very current. Oil.
Well, exactly, yeah. And it is incredibly prescient in that sense, because I mean, I was reading about this, and in 1965 nobody was thinking about an oil shortage. The Middle East and its oil production was very much as similar to a kind of colony in the hands of Europe and America. It's not really until we start to think about this novel in the light of the Gulf Wars, and particularly reasons for America to want power in Iraq, for example. Interesting when you read criticism of the book written in journals from around the kind of mid to late 2000s, where they're really looking at it in the light of the Iraq War, that this is not stuff that Herbert could have seen in and of itself with regard to the Middle East and oil, but it does foresee, as it were, what human nature will do. And that idea, obviously, around the presentation of the Fremen, I mean, they're a desert people, and so he draws on desert peoples, and that's evident in the way in which they are depicted in the film, in terms of clothing, in terms of race, in terms of language, but also that idea that they sort of the white and white coded houses of the galaxy look down on the Fremen, even though it's the Fremen who, in terms of the world of Arrakis, they are living, as you say, in harmony with it. Their technology is not about stripping their planet, it's about cohabiting with their planet. Coexisting. And the still suit is kind of like the ultimate recycling. It's like, if you really take seriously the fact that you have a finite resource, then you make sure that nothing of it is wasted. And so your entire clothing is there to capture that they don't lose more than a thimbleful of water from the body every day by recycling every single mouthful. So that's pretty cool.
Even the way that when they like kill their enemies, there was like a contraption I thought was really cool of part of the world building, that they were extracting the water from bodies, and that like even though they can drink it, they were like repurposing it for like cooling systems.
That's right, yeah.
And which was like a very cool detail.
There's that, obviously, that thing, isn't there, like about how you kind of like view people who are culturally different from you, and that sort of idea that, oh, it's gross, you're vacuum packing the dead to get all their water out and so on, versus the idea that actually this is kind of like respect, and about how if one of their own people die, the way that it's depicted in the film is that huge, almost like temple structure with the great pool of water, because they're creating these sacred pools where all the water from their own dead is collected, and that is not water for drinking or bathing in. It is water simply to presage this future where they will use the water for their green planet. So there's a kind of religious, sacred nature to
Yeah.
the water as well. The other thing about this planet, big worms. What do we think?
Oh yeah, big worms. So cool. I'd love to ride a big worm. They're also like obviously the worms are also kind of integrated into their religious system with
Yes.
the Jessica becoming the Reverend Mother and this
Mhm.
water of life,
Mhm.
sort of worm poison that they have to kill the worms for. They have to drown them in a pool of water. So not sure how in harmony that is. Okay, this is another big vouch against religion. No, but yeah, they're very like fantastical creatures. I think it's a good
Yeah,
school.
but
What do you
also
think?
they're fantastical, but they're also like so many of these things that we see kind of that Herbert creates. They're kind of
Mm.
they're on that cusp between the sort of the fantasy and the science fiction. They're,
Mm.
they're in the world of dragons, but they're also in the world of dinosaurs. This is this idea, I suppose, of a particularly kind of harsh environment that links back with ideas about early eras of the planet Earth, where huge animals that couldn't exist today did exist. Things on this kind of huge scale. And as you say, there
Mm.
is something they use the worms, but they also have this huge respect for them, both in terms of the way in
Mm.
which they're part of the ecosystem, and we know that there's, you know, a relationship between the spice and the worms.
Mm.
But they call them Shai Hulud, which in itself kind of gives a sense that they have a name for it that has like a reverence to it. That I think that it's supposed to be something like grandfather of the desert or something like that, according
Yeah.
to Frank Herbert. So this idea that there's like an ancestral relationship, a kind of respect there. And then, as you say, they do ride them, which on the one hand, very cool. On the other hand, I do think that I want to know a bit more about the steering,
Yeah.
about how
Also, once
you,
you're on, how do you get
yeah,
off?
how do you
I
get
just
off? We
don't.
never see a dismount. And how do you make sure it doesn't go back under the ground when you
Yeah,
want it?
exactly. So true. I'm
um,
so confused.
I think that there's perhaps we should just leave these secrets to the Fremen, but
Yeah.
yeah. But it's again, it's one of those things that is seen as, I suppose, kind of like monstrous, other, primitive by the Harkonnens, by the Emperor, by the Atreides, even source merely of fear rather than of kind of like harmony with the planet.
Mm.
Um,
What's like, what I also think is clever is how this specific method of transportation via the worms is the only way to get across to the south part, which they
mm,
describe as like this uninhabitable area. You got to go across sandstorms that are just like impossible to survive through otherwise. So again, it's just another way of like being like living in like cohabiting with the
yeah.
ecosystem and also
Mm,
like building a protect like using the desert to your like
mm.
to the Fremen advantage of like
Yeah,
creating
exactly.
around themselves.
Yeah,
Um
and like at the end, we get that idea that they use the timing of the huge sandstorm, for example, as a way of shielding their attack, and
yeah,
making it
yeah,
possible for them to attack.
yeah.
I think it's quite nice that the film moves away from, I suppose, one of the critiques potentially of the book is that it fits with the sort of noble savage idea that we get in things like Brave New World, that sort of the reject the kind of industrial, and we go back to the sort of primitive because it's beautiful, because it's the idea that this is a favorable thing. But actually the books, when you read them carefully, I think, but particularly the film and the way it visualizes it, sees there is artistry and technology and intellect and poetry and things like that, all bound
Yeah,
up in the depiction of the Fremen. Once we
yeah,
get past this sort of biased view of them that is held by the
yeah.
people who,
And like
as we
skill,
see,
yeah,
the
yeah,
like
yeah.
the Harkonnen don't even realize how many there are, or
Yes.
like, and then we have that sort of thing, don't we, where it gets called desert power, and we have this uncomfortable thing that on the one hand, yes, we're recognizing that the Fremen have this way of living that is in fact something that deserves a great deal more respect and attention, but Duke Atreides wants to harness it as part of his power, and Paul does ultimately harness
Yeah.
it, even though he says he doesn't want to.
Yeah. It's kind of like their way of like fighting and their way of it's
Mm.
kind of like almost like guerrilla warfare kind of
Mm. Yeah,
tactics.
yeah.
Um,
And again, knowing and using the desert, like
mm,
we see some particularly sort of visual scenes around the idea of like being under the sand and rising up out
yeah,
of the
and jumping
sand,
up. I guess
and
like
yeah,
at the time
exactly.
that the book was written, like with the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
and no, the American
Mm.
Vietnam War. I don't know. I
Mm.
think that's like must have also been partially
Mm. Yeah,
inspired.
yeah. So that's the planet that we're dealing with. But then we,
Hmm.
as we see these external influences on the planet, including religion and including the Bene Gesserit, as you mentioned in
Hmm.
your introduction. And the Bene Gesserit are interesting insofar as, I suppose, in terms of ideas around women in this world, but also in terms of types of power, and also in terms of like having a long view of history. I was interested by the name. So the Latin Bene Gesserit would mean either something like it will have been done well, or it could also be it may it have been done well. So it gives us a sense of that idea of kind of like prophecy and looking back and history and things like that in the way that the word works, but also this idea, I suppose, of being something being done, enacted, carried out well is subjective within the eyes of the Bene Gesserit.
Mm.
So they're a missionary group, as we see, but spreading a mission of what? This isn't a religion with a god.
Yes.
It, but is
So I guess their
a
mission
religion
is
of
just
myths.
yeah. So they've got the Missionaria Protectiva,
Mm, mm,
which is like described as the long-term program of seeding religious beliefs across the galaxy
mm,
so that agents could later exploit them. So I don't know whether they themselves are religious or believing in
mm,
any
yeah.
one kind of thing, but it's more like they fabricate
Yeah.
prophecies and myths to enact control. They just kind of
Yeah.
sound a bit cult-like. It's more like a sort of,
Yeah.
and they send out these missionaries to different houses, fronting as sort of advisors. And it's revealed to us that the sort of main Bene Gesserit, Reverend Mother, manipulated the emperor to sort of, I guess, bring about an end to the House of Atreides. But
Mm.
yeah, I just unclear what their like ultimate goal is with all of this.
I suppose it's a commentary on religion that argues that when religion, like religious institutions and their power, this is not about kind of like about faith in something, but it's actually saying what religious institutions do is use their message to seek power, and it's that power seeking rather than any idea around the divine or any idea of morals or principles that actually is what they're seeking. So, like if we think about this particularly in the construct of Christian missionaries during the spread of the British and other European empires, on the one hand, I am sure that when you look at kind of individual missionaries and clergy and so on who went out, they would have understood that within the context of having a true faith in God and thinking that they can make the heathens see the truth about Jesus Christ as their savior and so on. But of course, what it actually did was to consolidate the power for the empire that they represented. So although they might have assumed that what they were doing was truly out of some sort of real idea around evangelism and about doing something good, obviously what they were really doing was taking a Western idea and placing it into on top of the mythologies of wherever they were taking their missions. And I suppose they were supported in doing it because it was all part of the idea of creating control over native populations. So for the Bene Gesserit, Herbert has basically stripped away the idea that there's any kind of facade of actual belief in salvific religion. It's simply saying that actually, well, what happens if you control the narrative? And with the Fremen, we see that played out with the idea that if they believe in a Messiah, they'll think that something is going to happen in the future. So you don't rise up now because you're waiting for your leader who will secure your victory in the future. So it subjects them to sort of waiting. And then, of course, if you can select your Messiah, and you've got enough people who believe in it, then you can control what that Messiah does as well. So I guess it's both of those things. And for Jessica, it's unclear whether she kind of is ever supposed to believe that her son really is
It feels
the
like to me
Mahdi.
her ultimate sort of mission is to secure Paul's safety. I think
Mm,
that's like what she kind of
yeah.
seems to whisper to herself and her unborn daughter very strangely
Yeah.
um about, and this is kind of her mission to the south
Mm,
was to secure
mm,
people's belief in Paul as
yeah.
the Messiah, and it kind of felt like to me that it was like in an attempt to make sure the Fremen people protect him.
Yeah.
um
And raise him to power as well, I think, because
mm,
she's not just asking that they recognize him as somebody who is worthy of life, because Stilgar says to her, if you don't become Reverend Mother, then what are you useful for? Essentially, die or become this figure. So there's the protective bit, but there's also the idea that she also wants him to become the most powerful person among the Fremen. And there's this balance between kind of like her belief in there being a Messiah, because she's part of this story that's been created, and so the fact that she knows it's sort of completely artificial. And in the film, Paul is much more clear about this idea. Well, you made this up. This is a
yeah.
lie perpetuated by
And
your
he
people.
definitely at first seems to reject the
Mm,
the I guess the pull of the people for him to become this like religious messiah
yeah.
sort of person and to become their savior. And he's very much he's like rejecting this like white savior thing, being
Mm,
like, it needs to be someone of your own people that leads
yeah.
you.
He says that, and
Well, he's not
he
doesn't resist
says
it for very long.
no. I mean, he says to Chani, who is his partner, his girlfriend, who is Fremen, who is constantly contesting this idea that she doesn't necessarily believe him when he says things to her. But he does say that, she says, well, here we don't have noble houses, etc. Everybody is equal. And
Hmm.
he says, I want to be equal to you. But ultimately, that's kind of the final thing that he rejects, because he opts for a dynastic marriage with the
Yeah,
princess.
to be fair, a lot of people like I do think in like Paul Atreides, like I feel like you can't directly blame him for making that decision. Like he does feel like
Mm-hmm.
just a pawn in like a bigger web of like
Yeah.
series of events. I think I sympathize slightly with people who are kind of brought up in the aristocracy
Mm-hmm.
and like pushed into dynastic marriages. It's just kind of like,
Yeah.
well, that's expected of you from birth. So I'm not gonna blame you
Yeah.
directly. Like,
I think that
and to
that's a
me,
very fair point.
it's tactical for the Fremen
Yeah.
people. Like, I think
Yeah.
if he was like, "Oh, Chani, I'm gonna stick with you," it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, well, isn't his whole thing like sort of raising these people up from the obviously whether that's like a fabricated thing or not, and what the
Yeah.
motivations are behind that, but like,
I agree with you. I think that when you look at what Herbert sort of said about his own work and things like that, one of the main things that he was interested in was this idea about who are the people who have power and seek power. The whole idea around power corrupt, but he also had this sort of theory that people were drawn to power because they were easily corruptible, but also that the like structures around them, societal structures, control them even when they think that they are doing things for themselves. So you're right that, Paul, if he is stepping into this messiah figure, it's because he's essentially part of a structure that says this is the only way that you can effect
yeah,
change, which he thinks he is doing for the right reasons, because he thinks that he is becoming Fremen, but ultimately he can't cease being the Duke. I mean, we see it in the council, which I think is the big turning point, where he rejects all of their customs and traditions, and he uses both his kind of Bene Gesserit powers and his knowledge of the Fremen and the Fremen language and their customs, and he claims, I am the Duke, which how can he be the Duke of this planet that he seems to believe
has
belongs to
no
the Fremen?
house.
They don't
Yeah,
have they
exactly.
don't have dukes,
Yeah, yeah.
so he can never, ultimately let go of kind of that imperialist language of his past.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
also
he
big
wants to become
reveal,
emperor.
that Grandpa Paul is
Mm,
Duke of Harkonnen.
yeah,
What? That was like a
yeah,
big,
exactly.
it
I
was
know.
like the ultimate. enemy of both the House of Atreides
Yeah.
and the Fremen. So he's
Yeah.
like almost like, yeah, I don't know.
Which, and he claims that, if we are Harkonnens, we have to be Harkonnens and act that way, which again, it's the sort of victory at all costs thing. Ultimately, he turns to the threat of atomic weapons, nuclear war, which, again, in the sort of mid 60s, the idea of, I guess, the mutual destruction kind of idea that we have around nuclear pacts and so on is playing out there.
Yeah, or the idea of like that the one who can ultimately destroy something has control over it, I think.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Um,
Um, and it's one of those many times, isn't it, where that kind of idea that using a narrative and a myth to your own purposes is really valuable. Like, you tell a story about a leader, and even if they don't have those qualities, people will apply them to them. Paul has learned certain things, he's educated, he's intelligent, he obviously learns fast and things like that. But it's like when his mother drinks the water of life poison, and he basically says, it's just a trick. And so I said that it's very similar to like the con artist who is a alleged clairvoyant or whatever, who's just very good at cold reading people, and responding to people's needs and so on, what they want to hear. And it's very similar with the kind of Bene Gesserit skills of being able to command people with a certain tone of voice or those sorts of things. Should we just pick up on that thing about kind of like the white savior narrative? Because it's worth looking at kind of like what the film does in terms of its racial casting, I thought. Because I mean, like the Atreides house, which is obviously like the less bad imperial house, Duke Atreides saves people and
but
lets
less bad.
spice go and things like
Yeah,
that. But
yeah.
they're quite sort of, aren't we diverse? Benetton advert, one of every race kind of thing. Although I did read one article was about, yes, but they also kill most of their characters of color from the Atreides household. But obviously, Paul is white, his mother is white. The Harkonnens are all super white.
Yeah,
Um,
deeply pale.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the Fremen are brown and black faces.
Mm.
And so I suppose what I'm saying is, can we absolve Paul from being a white savior? Is anything that he does or says enough?
Like ultimately it's just like another form of like colonialism and imperialism.
Mm,
It's just like you brought in another just someone else. And
mm,
like ultimately these people are still sort of subdued under like a white rule almost,
yeah.
even though like I don't know. I thought what was really funny as well in the film was when Chani comes in to teach Paul like the ways of sand walking, and she was like, "Oh, you sand walk like a drunk lizard," and she's like showing him how to do it, and he's like, "Well, actually,
Yeah.
all the anthropologists that I in the movie that I watched, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is fantastic! Like, it was just
Yeah.
so well
It was
done.
well
I was
done.
like, this is
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that like I
Yeah.
think the depiction of their relationship
Mm.
sprouting was quite
Mm.
fantastic. But that was just such like of course.
Yes, exactly.
It was
Exactly.
fantastically illustrated.
Yeah. Yeah. So that sort of white supremacy and also mansplaining combined
Yes.
into
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I wondered about, I don't know, they welcome him into their culture, and he clearly works hard to kind of prove himself and to do the things that they do. But he also wants to kind of like become Fremen in a way that, I don't know, taking on an identity that is not his. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
and obviously, ultimately, he kind of fails to do that because he has to sort of fit with the prophecy. The prophecy says that he comes from the outside. So, he
The voice from
reclaims
the
his,
outer world.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, reclaims that identity ultimately. But there is a part that is a bit like, has a real sort of like fetishizing of their culture, almost like
Mm.
it starts with respect for it, but I think it sort of becomes a bit more than that. But as I said, they do by and large welcome him, and they give him, appropriate names and things like that. You wrote a few notes about the parallels with Lawrence of Arabia, which I think are very
Yes. So I'd
apt.
never heard of this guy before.
Oh, really?
But
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah,
yeah,
very,
yeah, in
yeah.
fact.
My dad's a big fan of Lawrence of
Oh,
Arabia, but
really?
yeah, a really interesting historical figure, and
Yes.
a famous film adaptation of it as well.
Oh,
So,
really? Oh, I might have to, that'll be my next
mm,
watch. But
yeah.
yeah, so Frank Herbert like explicitly stated Lawrence of Arabia to be the inspiration for Paul
Mhm.
Atreides. So he was T.E. Lawrence was a British archaeologist, soldier, and writer, and he was involved in the Arab Revolt between 1916 and 1918 against the Ottoman Empire. So he basically helped unite all these various tribes and guerrilla forces to fight alongside the British against the Ottomans, promising them independence and self-rule after victory, which he like genuinely believed in this promise.
Yeah.
And he was like similarly to Paul, famous for his deep cultural immersion, dressed in Arab robes, spoke fluent Arabic, traveled by camel. This is just like when I was searching. This is like
Yeah,
one
but
of
you're
them.
right. It was,
Yeah.
these sort of things all
um,
stand out about him.
yeah, and he like learned these sort of guerrilla warfare tactics. So he was like in the West, this was all sort of like
Mhm.
romanticized, and they painted him as this sort of desert hero figure. But yeah, in the end, there was this sort of big betrayal, not by Lawrence himself directly,
Yeah.
but in the end, obviously, the British and the French
Mhm.
decided to carve up the Middle
Yeah.
East,
Yeah.
and establish mandates across these various countries. So
Yeah.
yeah, so obviously everyone wasn't very happy about that, and that's sort of
Yeah.
like
And I
led
guess
to
there's,
the Middle Eastern conflict today, very relevant. But yeah, sorry,
yeah.
as we were saying,
Well, I was just going to say there's this idea of, I suppose, with Paul, it almost would never matter how well intentioned he was because he is one
just a tool of
cog
the
within
Bene
a kind of,
Gesserit.
yes, a
Yeah,
tool of the Bene Gesserit and a cog within the imperial machine.
yeah.
Ultimately, he decides that he's going to kind of use that to try and serve his purposes, I suppose, by stepping back into his kind of like role as duke. But that in itself is obviously a form of betrayal because it, well, for all what you say about dynastic marriage and so on as a tool within this world, it still implies that he needs to marry somebody from, as
Who's
it were, this kind of like white nobility.
powerful in the
And
empire?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that Charlie can never be that because by nature, as Fremen, she could never fulfill that role. Obviously, it's a bit of a parallel with the fact that his father didn't marry his mother. Jessica is a concubine. His father
Mm.
was, in the book, is very clear, didn't marry because he needed the option of making a dynastic marriage. So, like, keeping that open. He
But
dies,
obviously
but
Paul, yeah, he dies, and Paul
yeah.
was going to be his heir anyway, despite the
Yes,
fact that
exactly. Yeah. So in this world, that's fine. I think you have your heir by your concubine.
which was
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but
fair enough.
I mean, it does raise this question with the Bene Gesserit. Obviously, we see them in this kind of like role in terms of international relations, as it were, and things like that. But they also have
Yeah.
this kind of like, as you said, this role as advisors and including
Interstellar
particularly as
relations.
yeah, interstellar
Sorry,
relations,
God.
indeed. Yeah.
Sorry.
Um,
As you were saying.
but they're also, it's not just about that kind of like big political picture. It's all about like small scale political picture as wives, concubines, advisors,
Hmm.
secretaries, those kinds of things. Um,
Yeah.
so, this is a patriarchal society. Herbert is drawing on obviously a kind of a tradition in the way that he depicts it. It's not necessarily saying that he kind of like approves it. But what did you think about this idea of kind of like how women and men were depicted in the roles of kind of dukes and barons versus Bene Gesserit?
Yeah, so the Bene Gesserit is sort of like, I think in addition to them being kind of these like advisors manipulating in the background, they have this like they also have the sort of almost mystical, they can
Mm,
use the voice, and they're sort of like
mm,
clairvoyant. So I don't know. And I think well in the notes it's written that they've sort of got referred to as witches in some
yes.
part of the
Yeah.
film, which obviously sort of plays into that.
Mm,
Um I guess in the misogynistic way that like women with power like will
mhm,
abuse it, and it's about
mhm,
sort of like steering men off their path and
mhm.
whatever, sort of like the Adam and Eve story. And
Yeah,
um
yeah.
but yeah, I guess there, because also like there it is shown that like the Bene Gesserit are also willing to use their womanly, they have like sort of the Reverend Mother was saying to one of her sort of
Mm,
subordinates about why she didn't go in and manipulate one of the
yeah,
Harkonnen herself, because she was
yeah.
like, oh, I'm more of a motherly figure and I don't think that manipulation tactic would have worked on him, so I brought in you as more of like
Mm,
a sort of concubine, like
yeah.
manipulating him more sexually. I don't
Yeah,
know.
no.
What do you think about it?
I think it's interesting because I think there's a number of ways of reading it. Obviously, on the one hand, they are somewhat negative in the idea of their manipulation, but then no more so than any of the men are. It's just like a different
Mm,
type of power.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Sort of
and
soft
so
power.
yeah, you could read this definitely as a kind of like, I suppose there's a feminist reading of it that sort of says, these men, they're impetuous, they turn to violence and cruelty and things like that. The women in the roles of the Bene Gesserit, they have this high level of intellectual mental rigor that
Mm,
allows them to focus on a much bigger picture than the whims of the moment. They're thinking about manipulating, you say, kind of like from a section and bodily point of view. They're thinking about bloodlines and who. That's yes, Lady Margot Fenring, I think, the one who conceives a child by Fade Routher, the horrible, horrible Harkonnen nephew. She uses sort of sexual and verbal manipulation of him,
mm,
recognizes his weaknesses, learns about the fact that, he has certain proclivities towards pain, both his own and inflicted on others, and that this can be used to manipulate him. That, the fact that he's a sociopath doesn't necessarily mean that they can't use him for their purposes, and so on. So there's that kind of sort of thing, yes, it's not just women kind of like sleeping their way to the top or something like that. This is about
mm.
women sort of within this power structure, recognizing where they can have power and also that
Yeah.
power can have
Also
a
like a
much,
tactical
yeah,
sleeping though. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like a bigger and
it's
longer influence. Um, and it's linked with education and training and has quite a level of sophistication to it. And obviously it's also women in a kind of priestly role, which
mm,
is obviously familiar from some religions and from ancient religion and things like that. But in the major Abrahamic religions, women have not taken priestly roles in most versions until relatively recently, and therefore this idea of rejecting kind of patriarchal idea around priestly power, as it were, and giving it to women is quite important. But then, of course, I suppose there's the other side of things, which is essentially that we could look at it as an idea that women, as you say, will always abuse their power, and then there's this question about whether like what Paul's role is within this. We were talking about this when we were planning, weren't we? Just sort of saying, like, what is the gendered element with Paul, because there's, as it were, hard power, masculine power, power with the sword. Some of it is mental as well, tactical and so on, and it's about education and things like that. But then there's also this specifically feminine power, which is the power of the Bene Gesserit. I think the senior Reverend Mother, doesn't she call him an abomination because he gets taught to use the voice and things like that.
mm.
So I just wondered whether you thought, do you think it's like a positive thing that Paul adopts and uses these kind of specifically womanly kind of things, or is that a negative thing where he is basically kind of like appropriating power from women?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's, especially with like gender, it feels a bit, it doesn't feel like the word appropriating doesn't seem for me to fit in, just because it
Mm,
is like, and this is more in the modern like modern
mm,
perception. I'm sure this is not
yeah,
how they think about it
no,
in Dune at all, but it is like
I agree.
a
It's a difficult,
fluid
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
thing. Like,
yeah,
I don't know, and like gender's a performance
mm,
anyway, so anyone can sort of, whatever
yeah,
your
yeah,
sex might be, can play into that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, it like seems to break some sort of tradition within the Bene
mm,
Gesserit, uh, that this sort of Reverend
mm,
Mother's not very happy about. But yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say it's like definitively a bad thing.
mm,
Whether Paul then decides to use whatever he decides to use these skills
mm,
for, using the voice or whatnot.
mm.
Um, I don't know. I saw a really funny comment about the film that overall, June's just about, is a cautionary tale to mothers who tell their sons that they're special, which I thought was very funny.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I mean, I
yeah.
thought. Oh, I mean, obviously agreeing with everything you say about gender, and then looking at the fact
Mm.
that this is a text that creates these, well, with the exception maybe of the Fremen, particularly in the film, where obviously women are soldiers and
Yes. Yeah,
so
yeah.
on.
And they specifically
But
say that in their culture, men and women are
yeah,
equal.
although in practice we sort of see more women in the religious roles and so on. So I sort of
Yeah.
was still a bit of a like sort of gender divide. But you're right, the Fremen, we seem to see that sort of idea around kind of like gender equality and not following kind of traditionally gendered roles. But obviously in the great houses, we're very clearly a sort of
Patriarchal.
patriarchal divide, with the exceptions we said of like the Bene Gesserit. So if we say that, we see that as one of the negative things about the depiction of the great houses, these are obviously they're the big problem source of within the text, then there's definitely an argument for saying that what Paul does in terms of eroding or crossing that traditional kind of like gender divide, he
Yeah,
finds
which
it difficult
women,
him
yeah.
yeah, he
It
finds it
seems like
difficult
women aren't
himself,
able
but
to do themselves.
mm,
It's like, okay, it's only going
yeah,
one way where Paul's crossing over to the sort of traditionally
yeah,
female
yeah,
role, and he's able
yeah,
to live both. He's able
yeah,
to live quite fluidly between those both the
mm,
feminine and the masculine,
yeah,
whilst it doesn't
exactly,
seem like women are extended the same.
yeah. Well,
Um,
this is true.
well, as to the
There's
same extent, I guess.
Yeah. And
Um,
I suppose it comes back to this idea of the myth that's been created is specifically about a man who can do these things that are traditionally ascribed to women, like he'll be able to drink the water of life and live. So the Bene Gesserit have essentially invented, an argument that says it has to be a man because within
yes,
this patriarchal society, the only one who could do this thing is a man. I mean, it's one of the arguments that people put forward, Dave, why prophets and messiahs in religions have been men is because they appear at a point in history where society is patriarchal. Would Jesus Christ have been able to preach and teach had he been a
a
woman?
woman.
I mean, there's some great theological texts on Jesus as a kind of intersex figure and so on. Read Susanna Cornwall's works, really, really good. But yeah, but overall, obviously, traditionally, he, him applied to God and Jesus.
Hmm.
So you could say that there's something here that is being done that is rather different, kind of in terms of how we might see this. We could also, I suppose, see it as like a sort of feminist sort of thing, which is saying that, without the feminine elements, Paul can never be the best leader that he could be. Unfortunately, he does rather screw it all up in terms of
Yeah, as we
causing,
come to
you
find
know,
out.
causing a holy war.
Mass starvation and billions dead as he sees in his
That's right.
vision.
What should he
Yeah.
have done differently, do you think?
I don't know, not become a leader maybe? I'm not sure, but I guess
Yeah.
obviously that's like his whole acceptance into the Fremen people was based on the fact that they believed him to be the Messiah. So he was simply
Mm,
the same way that Jessica was said to have become the Reverend Mother or die.
mm,
It was sort of like again, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of like conversation about free will and determinism and
mm,
whether the characters in the story, just like in this sort of big cosmic web of events, are like predetermined or
yeah.
whether they actually have choices.
I suppose we would like to believe that Paul, especially with all of the tools and skills and many kind of like levels of self-awareness that he's surely gained, would also be able to see a way of being a leader that was not
Yes.
becoming the worst of himself and the worst of kind of
Yeah.
like the great houses.
Yeah.
Um, he falls into a pattern despite his aspirations to the contrary. He seems very limited in understanding how to be a leader. Surely, I don't know, you can empower others to lead, be a good ally to the Fremen, not just
Yeah.
like speak in their place, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. What did you think about with sort of like, Paul develops the ability to see into the future. He can see the
mm,
past and he can see the
mm,
future. And how do you think that like how do you think that feeds in, especially with his visions that
mm.
he gets? Do you think that's
Yeah.
like provides him does having that foresight
Mm,
provide him with more choice or more free
mm.
will, or is that since the future is predetermined, does he put himself in a position where he has no choice at all, or
Well, he says that he sees after he's drunk the water of life and been resurrected in good messianic style. He says that he can see like all the possible, well, like a range of possible futures, which would suggest non-deterministic understanding of the future. He can make choices that will lead to the best possible outcome. So he's basically just become much more, I guess, savvy about how actions and consequences will play out. He says he can walk like the narrow line that doesn't lead to terrible famine and war and death and
it's
so
more
on.
of like a compatibilism, where
Yeah.
sort of
I
like
mean, I guess if we
there's
understand,
choices, but it's limited, like, and that's walking
yeah,
the like I
yeah.
guess the line that he was kind of talking about.
Mm. I mean, it's obviously one of the things that people read differently in the text because it's kind of like it's sort of mystical. And seeing the future generally I'm associated with prophecy and that sort of thing, but it's also not something that most of us can do in the sense of having dreams that come to life and things like that. But the way that it's also depicted is quite like not like sciencey but sort of like rationalized, like mental training, taking drugs, um you know various things that like stimulate the brain to work in other ways. And
Yeah, bit
there's
of a
this
method
thing.
to the madness.
Yeah, exactly. And if, we tie that in with the idea that, time is merely a dimension and the human brain has got greater capabilities than, ever understand, then it's sort of, I'm not saying that it could ever be done in terms of like seeing the past and the future, but the idea of having greater awareness of how things that have once happened affect things that are now and how decisions we make now will affect things in the future. I mean, surely that's just good, like strategic thinking. So he's just got that on like a massive scale, or like imagining outcomes based on available facts. That's also a skill. I mean, they're all basically on drugs. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's what it's spice. That's what it is.
yeah,
And also, is it true that I might have misread this somewhere, but once you're exposed to spice, if it's removed, you also die. So once you
I think
become,
that's very possible. I think it becomes like integrated
mm,
into you. It makes your eyes
don't
change
quote
color after
me on
all.
that. Yeah, it does. Yeah,
Mm.
it's just like just promoting more
Yeah.
Aryan sort of like
Yeah.
blue-eyed people, super powered,
That's
whatever.
true.
Yeah,
Yeah. I don't
true.
know. It's
Just
interesting
joking.
that in our last episode we had cronol, this drug that was
Yeah.
derived from engine waste, and now we've got
Yeah.
spice, which is something that could be used for like intergalactic travel or whatever, but also is you know, you can put it in your food and get yourself slightly sort of, I don't know what the sort of lesser effects of it are, like hallucinations, or whether you just like feel better or what it is, because we only
Mm.
really see Paul and Jessica responding to it. But so beyond the end of this two films slash first novel, you did a little bit of thinking about kind of like where it goes next. So
Yeah.
should we just finish off by thinking about that?
Yeah, so obviously sort of where we're seeing this going is that Paul, as he kind of I guess he kind of grows into this prophecy, and it sort of it grows into the prophecy about saving the Fremen and converting their world to a paradise. And I guess it sort of shows how the Fremen eventually become dependent on him, and the sort of, I guess, how this whole thing spirals as we're sort of like nearing the end of the episode. Like, for me, the
Mm,
messaging of the story is the sort of
mm,
like danger of like religious iconography, and how like
mm,
concentration of power means that defining decisions through one person can lead to biased outcomes and personal failings, and also blind following of these messiahs can lead to sort of ignorance of complexity, especially, for example, around
mm,
Paul's visions. People, rather than in like interpreting them as sort of suggestions of the future, as more of
mm,
like sort of godly commands.
mm,
And people interpret the events that happen around Paul, whether they fit into the prophecy or not, they sort of restructure them and mold them to fit their
mm.
beliefs anyway, sort of like cookie cutter style.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but yeah, so I get Frank Herbert in the later books writes about the Golden Path. So I guess this is maybe to come in movie 4, probably, if it
Yeah.
was going to be the Holy War next. So yeah, Paul sort of, as we sort of understand, starts this holy war, causes lots of famine, destruction, quite horrible stuff, and he gets visions about humanity's extinction. And the Golden Path is basically this solution for humanity making sure that it doesn't become extinct. And it's envisioned by Paul and his son Leto, and there's sort of like a two-part sort of plan. And part of the Golden Path is also sort of to be the antidote to humanity's tendency to follow such sort of messiah figures and fall into
Mhm.
this like religious iconography and worship. And so part one is sort of this big giant psychological conditioning experiment where there'll be this one big tyrannical ruler who will control people and rule in a sort of authoritarian manner, and it make all of humanity hate control to such an extent that it caused them to preserve freedom at any cost, and sort of that has ultimately become the rejection of what Paul has become. And the second part is to then scatter all of humanity from across the galaxy, to make sure that if anything ever happened on one planet, that there would be other populations of humans to continue living on. So yeah, and this is eventually carried out by Paul and Chani's son, Leto II, who decides to sacrifice, I guess, in a sort of for the greater good, sacrifices morals, and he fuses with one of the sort of sandworms and becomes this immortal figure that rules over the galaxy for 3,500 years, and eventually is rejected by humanity and sort of causes them to deeply hate any sort of single figure rising up. But yeah, I guess it's sort of this like paradox of freedom through discipline,
Mm.
where like short-term restrictions, or in the case of Dune, 3,500 years, which is kind of short term in the like sort of
Yeah, I
settled
guess in
universe.
the sort of,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and it's to like build the skills, resilience, and social structure needed for long-term autonomy. So yeah,
yeah.
that's
I
kind
mean,
of
I
where the
suppose
story seems to lead on to. Go on, sorry, Claire.
I was just going to say that if we compare it to like, say, like 3,500 years, like, in terms of how humanity's kind of systems have changed, these things, maybe not 3,500 years, but if we just look at like the sort of transition from the Bronze Age through to the rise of the first imperial powers, for example. We look at, I guess, the time of the Romans through to the time of now, in terms of like, how that's changed several
Mm,
thousand years. These are not very exact sort of similar times,
yeah,
but in that sense, on the other hand, there's part of me that still has the optimism that really, 2 terms of Donald Trump should be enough for us to recognize that we don't need a third term to learn our lesson about.
yeah.
I mean, not
Sort of like
our lesson, obviously,
authoritarian
not your
rulership,
and
yeah.
my lesson, but like,
And the listener's lesson, yeah.
yeah, exactly. But MAGA Republicans, you would
Mm,
hope would, the scales would have fallen from their eyes by then. But then we see what's happening in America, and yet we're still seeing the rise of populism in Europe.
mm,
The lessons of the Second World War are only a century ago. I mean, not even a century ago,
yeah,
and we're already forgetting them. So maybe the human memory is too short for it to be simply a matter of, one lifetime or
yeah.
whatever. Maybe we do need it to be generationally ingrained.
So
But
if
it
there's
does seem
anyone
a
out
lot to
there,
ask.
yeah, who wants to be a dictator for the next
Mm,
sort of millennium, hit
mm.
us up. We'll sort of Bene Gesserit our way to the top.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sandworm integration
We
optional.
can force you to be our next messiah. So
That's
there
right.
you
Yeah.
go. Lead us to our freedom and to our paradise.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, that
Amazing.
was whew,
Yeah, well,
Bit-
we're also recording
lots
this
to
in
digest.
massively hot weather.
It's
It's
like
like
32
being on
degrees today.
Arrakis. It's just
We're like really getting immersive with
That's
this
right. Yeah,
episode.
yeah.
So.
Should have put my still suit on to like deal with the sweat. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you
Thank
everyone for
you.
listening. We're going to do Arcadia next, I think. Yeah, I think that would be a really good one to like contrast with some of our discussions and Snowpiercer. So, Arcadia, Belgian dystopia, Channel 4 thing. Look out for that. And that will be 2 weeks after this. In the meantime, however, you will not miss out if you subscribe to our Substack, then you will get other stuff in our alternate weeks. And you can also check us out on Instagram and Blue Sky. And on our website, it's dystopian fiction has been moved to currentaffairs.com. And we always love to hear from you. So do get in touch with your ideas. And the massive Dune fans who have read every single possible novel and adaptation and so on, you can let us know everything we got wrong.
Let us know where we got it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. That'll be good. Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Marsha.
Thank you.